Greetings of the day, dear learners. I am Dr. Giftsy Dorcas from the Department of English, Kristu Jayanti College. Today we'll be delving into the topic that is related to research methodology. We'll be analyzing one of the tools, which is questionnaire. So questionnaire, I'm sure many of us have come across questionnaires. We've also answered questionnaires. But have you wondered, how do you design those? Are there any criteria behind them? In today's class, we will be analyzing how do you design a questionnaire, what are the different components that come into play, what is the function of a questionnaire, and also we'll be seeing the structure of a questionnaire. So come along with me in this journey as we learn about questionnaires. So what is a questionnaire? A questionnaire is a set of questions that is developed in order to gain information from the respondents. It may be pertaining to a particular problem that you're trying to find answers to. It would pertain to your research topic. So definitely the basic requirement of a questionnaire is that it should spell out the research objectives and they need to be converted into clear questions. So all your research problems would fall into different categories of questions. So what is the function of questionnaires? So questionnaires are used basically for 4 functions, namely for measurement, for description, for comparison, and for inference. When it comes to measurement, it is used to measure the various variables that are involved in your research study. For example, the information that you collect pertaining to the name, the sex, the age, the occupation, the income, etc. are concrete data that would be used for measurement purpose. The second purpose is description. It describes about the population that you are studying, meaning it talks about the sample size that you've collected and what information is there about them that you want to convey to the readers. So it describes about your population. Third, it compares. It compares the different samples. So each individual respondent that you have in a questionnaire is considered as a sample. And these samples' responses are compared with each other. And from that, you can derive results. The fourth purpose is of inference. So from all the data that you gather through your questionnaire, you are able to infer information about the population. It gives you explanation about why or how something happens. It finds associations or correlationships between the various factors that are involved in your study. So herein lie the 4 purposes of a questionnaire, which are measurement, description, comparison, and inference. Moving on, let's get to know about how do you design a questionnaire? What are the steps involved in designing a questionnaire? So the steps involved in designing a questionnaire are: first, you need to define your goals and objectives of your research. What is the purpose behind this questionnaire? You need to define that. The second step would be use the questions that are suitable for your sample. So you need to take into account the sample, the number of people, the respondents. You have to take them into your mind and then frame questions accordingly. So step 3 would be for you to decide on your questions and also the length of a questionnaire. How long is it going to be? How many questions are going to be there in the questionnaire? And also the order of the questions is determined in the 3rd step. The following 4th step would be a step which is very essential, which is to test your questionnaire. So a pre-test of your questionnaire is very essential. In order to do a pre-test, you can administer it, you can give it to your peers, you can give it to people who know, and you can see if the questionnaire that you have created, is it understandable, is it easy enough for them to decipher the meaning and they are able to answer to all the questions that you've framed. The next step would be step 5, which is to decide on the method how you're going to administer this questionnaire. What method would you incorporate to administer? Will it be a person in person? Will it be something through a telephonic conversation? So that is decided in step 5. And step 6 is motivating your respondents to answer. So these are the various steps involved in designing a questionnaire. Moving further, we are going to see the types of questionnaires. So basically, the types of questionnaires are online questionnaire, mail questionnaire, telephone questionnaire, and in-person questionnaire. This is based on the mode of how the questionnaire is given to the respondents. Online questionnaire, an example would be the Google forms that we answer, we've seen from time to time. So you give the questionnaire to the respondents in online mode and they respond to you. The second is mail questionnaire. In mail questionnaire, all the questions that you want to ask the respondents are mailed to the respondent's address and they respond and they send back the answers to you. The third would be telephone questionnaire. Herein, you make a telephonic conversation with the respondents, ask them the questions and they respond to you. So that's telephone questionnaire. The last is in-person questionnaire, where you meet the respondent in person and get their answers for all the questions that are involved that you have designed in your questionnaire. So these are the 4 types of questionnaire: online questionnaire, mail questionnaire, telephone questionnaire, and in-person questionnaire. So moving further, we're going to see the types of questions. So basically, there are 2 types of questions that can be formed or that can be made in your questionnaire. One is open-ended question and 2 is close-ended questions. So open-ended questions are unstructured. Why unstructured? Because you do not know, as a researcher, you do not know the response that you expect from the respondents. So it's very unstructured. So all the words, logic and structure is provided by the respondent to the researcher. An example of an open-ended question would be, what is your answer? What is your age? And another would be, I like Nescafe because, and then the respondent fills their answers. Here you cannot predict what the answer will be given by the respondent. Hence, it is an unstructured form of a question. And you can use these open-ended questions at 3 different places in your questionnaire. First, at the beginning of the questionnaire, wherein you ask them to fill in their basic details, demographic details. The second would be you can use it for probing and getting to know more understanding about the response that has been given by the respondent. For example, why do you feel that way? Or you want your respondent to elaborate on how or why do they feel, or why do they say something like this? So then you can definitely, for the reason of clarification, you can frame these questions and keep them in between. The last would be where you can use these open-ended questions is when you need suggestions or final opinions in a questionnaire from the respondents. So open-ended questions can be placed in the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, depending on the purpose for which you are framing the questions. The next kind of questions that you can frame are close-ended questions. So close-ended questions are very restrictive in nature because here the researcher has control and you give the alternatives the respondents has to choose from. So there are different types based on how the questions are framed. So the first type of close-ended question is dichotomous questions. Dichotomous are very restrictive. They just have 2 alternatives. So an example is stated here, which is, have you read the new book by Dan Brown? So the respondent can either answer an yes or a no. So there's just 2 options. So this is an example of a dichotomous question. The second is multiple choice question. We're all very familiar with multiple choice questions. So over here, various alternatives are given and the applicant or the respondent needs to just choose between the one whichever is applicable for them. An example stated here, how much do you spend on grocery products? The options include average in a month, which include less than rupees 2,500, between 2,500 and rupees 5,000, more than rupees 5,000. So here the respondent can choose whichever is applicable to them. It can be one response. Or you can extend it and give them an option for choosing multiple responses by using the checklist option. So this is the second form of close-ended question, which is multiple choice question. The third would be to use scales. So a scale which is given as an example over here is the Likert scale. So in Likert scale, you designate between strongly dislike and strongly agree. You give numbers to each of the preferences, each of the choices, and the respondents can choose whichever is applicable to them. An example in a statement is given over here. Academic detailing is a useful form of education that aligns providers' prescribing behavior with evidence-based practice. So if the respondent strongly agrees, then he can choose 5 as an option. So this is the third form of questions that you can design as a close-ended question in your questionnaire. So I hope you've understood the 2 types of questions that can be framed in your questionnaire. 1, close-ended, 2, open-ended. Next, what are the different criteria for question designing? There are a lot of criteria, but over here I will be discussing 7 important criteria for question designing. First is clearly specify the issue. So you need to be having clarity in the question that you've designed. Your question should be able to answer the questions who, what, when, and depending on the question's purpose, it can also answer why and how. So it is always imperative that you do a quality check of all the questions that you design. 2 sentence examples are given below. The one, which newspaper do you read, does not qualify, it does not answer all the questions who, what, when, why, and how. So that it is not a good question to be put into your questionnaire. Whereas the second question, which newspaper or newspapers did you read personally, read at home during the last month? In case of more than one newspaper, please list all that you read. Here, this question, it answers all the questions stated above. Who, what, when, why, and how. And hence, it's a complete question that can be included in your questionnaire. The second criteria for question designing is use simple terminology. The terminologies that you use, the words that you choose for framing your questions must be understandable by the respondent. You cannot use technical terms that are like jargons that would hamper the understanding of the respondents. So hence it is advised that you use everyday language and avoid technical terms. 2 examples are given below. Do you think thermal wear provides immunity? In the first question, we see that the term immunity may not be understandable by all the respondents. All people will not have an understanding of the term. They may not know the meaning of the term immunity. So you can reframe your question as, do you think thermal wear provides you with protection from the cold? This would be a more perfect question, and the respondents will also be able to understand the question better. The third criteria is to avoid ambiguity in your questions. So certain words or some set of words create ambiguous meaning because they have same words may have multiple meanings, and when respondents come across such words, they get confused and they are not able to give the right answer. So an example is given below. How often do you visit Pizza Hut? The options are never, occasionally, sometimes, often, regularly. The options occasionally and sometimes mean the same. And also, often and regularly also mean the same. So in such a circumstance, when you give it to a respondent, he might get confused which option to choose. The only option that is applicable and that is right is never. And not all respondents are going to give you the answer never. So it is advised that you reframe it in such a way that it is more clear, there is clarity in what is being stated. So you can reframe it as, in a typical month, how often do you visit Pizza Hut? Less than once, 1 or 2 times, 3 or 4 times, more than 4 times. So this is the third criteria for question designing. The fourth criteria would be to avoid leading questions. In certain questions, you would frame it in such a way that you would force the respondents to give an answer. For example, read the first question. Do you think that working mothers should buy ready-to-eat food when that might contain some chemical preservatives? Over here, we see that we are forcing the respondents to give the answer no. So such kinds of questions must be avoided. The next question, do you think that working mothers should buy ready-to-eat food, is more as a neutral standpoint where the responder can take his side. So avoid leading questions. The next fifth criteria would be to avoid loaded questions. Loaded questions contain issues that are very sensitive. Some respondents will not give honest answers to these kind of sensitive issues that you raise in your question. Hence, avoid such kind of questions. Below is an example. Will you take dowry when you get married? I'm sure many of them will not be willing to answer this question honestly. So rather you can reframe it as, do you think most Indian men would take dowry when they get married? So this is the fifth criteria for you to design a question. The sixth criteria would be to avoid implicit choices and assumptions. So usually in some questions, sometimes you might hide some of the alternatives and you might just give one option for the respondent to understand. And here he will not be able to give his proper view. For example, are you in favor of the Commonwealth Games 2010 that was held in India? Over there, it's just trying to find out if he liked it or not. No other factors that are involved why you're asking the question is not answered over there. So over here, you can reframe it as, are you in favor of the Commonwealth Games 2010 that was held in India if they resulted in increased revenue from tourism? So this question will help you get a better answer, and the respondent also will understand why you are asking such a question. So the sixth criteria is to avoid implicit choices and assumptions. The seventh criteria would be to avoid double-barrel questions, meaning using questions that have two complex ideas or two variables in the very sentence itself. For example, did the training you went through make you feel more motivated and effective in your job? Here there are two differing variables in the question. One is whether you were motivated and the other is whether this helped you be effective in your job. So two differing variables. So such kind of questions cannot be answered truthfully by the respondent because some of the respondents might be motivated by the training while others may be effective in their job. They might not have felt motivated by the training. So to avoid such kind of questions, you can split them into two and give them as separate questions. Like, did the training you went through make you feel motivated at your job? And as another question, did the training you went through make you feel more effective at your job? So this is the seventh criteria, which is to avoid double-barrel questions. So these were the criteria for your question designing in your questionnaire. Now we'll move on to the last part, which is the structure of a questionnaire. So the basic structure of a questionnaire would be an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So the introduction part would consist of the title and the introduction. In the title, you state clearly the reason why you're giving this questionnaire. Example, you want to conduct a survey on reading young adult fiction. So you want to find out from the respondents how do they read young adult fiction or not. There you put in the titles that this is a survey kind of a questionnaire. The second is an introduction. Briefly you explain what is the exact purpose behind this question, and you also give here the instructions that need to be followed by your respondents. And also you need to assure the confidentiality if it is applicable. The example given here is, this survey aims to gather feedback on our services. Your responses will remain anonymous. So you can state this way and you can keep the data very brief and the instructions also very clear. Moving further, you can also give demographic questions and core questions. This consists of the body of your questionnaire. So demographic questions, these are optional. But suppose they will be used as variables for your research, then definitely you can make them mandatory. Like age, gender, educational qualification, and occupation. So based on your choice, based on how you're going to use them, you can keep it or you may not keep them. The next is the core questions, the actual questions that you framed for whatever you want to find out an answer to. You should have converted your objectives to clear-cut questions, and here the respondents have to answer every question. So it will be made mandatory questions. Moving to the last part, which is the closing section or the concluding part. Here you thank the respondents for their time, and you can also give them an option for giving an additional comment or a feedback on what they have given. So example would be, thank you for your feedback. If you have any additional comments, please share them below. So in today's session, we did